Welcome to Decoding the Talmud, our 6-week journey inside the story, substance, and significance of the book that defines Judaism, Lesson 2. Today's lesson is titled The Mishnah, and we are going to examine the origins, the authors, and the contents of Judaism's first legal code, the first writing down of the oral law. Today's lesson is generously sponsored by, or co-sponsored, I should say, by Danny Levin and Mark Essenston, who will both be here this evening. We thank them very much for their sponsorship. And before we begin today's lesson, I just want to review what we did last week, right? So last week we had introduced the oral law, and we had explained that the oral law as we know it today is really can be divided into 3 sections. So of course you have the written law, that's the 5 books of Moses. And I actually want to make a little footnote to that statement from last week. Last week I said that the written law is the 5 books of Moses. On a technical level, and I'm just saying this because I don't want you to say that you came to a class with Rabbi Zoshi Rifkin and he said the written law is the 5 books of Moses and that's it, and that's what the written law is. Technically, the written law can be expanded to be the entire 24 books of what's called Tanakh. Tanakh is 3 Hebrew letters, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, or Torah, the prophets and the writings, or scriptures. And all 24 of those books together have been canonized into what we call the written law. But there is a hierarchy. In other words, the first 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, that's what was written by Moses. That's what was written. First of all, that's what was written by Moses during his lifetime. In other words, the 5 books of Moses end with Moses going into the land of Israel. So that's all technically part of the written law. But for the purpose of our conversation today, and that, by the way, that's why every word of the written law, even like, for example, Tehillim, which is Psalms written by King David many years later, every single word we hold to be very exact and to be holy and to be from prophecy or from whatever it is. If you want to know more about the difference between the 5 books of Moses and the 24 books, etc., I highly recommend checking out a course that I gave called Booksmart, particularly Lesson 1. I will link it in the after lesson email, Booksmart Lesson 1, in which I go through all 24 books. That lesson actually came together with a map that went through all the different books of the written law, etc. Okay, but that's the end of my parenthetical. But the written law is only 1/4, right? What are the other 3 parts of it? They are what we call the oral law, and the oral law can be divided into 3 sections. Let me just remind you, you have the laws that were received by Moshe, right? That's what we're calling received. They were received by Moshe together with the text of the Torah. So my common example is, God tells him, write down the words, you shall bind them for a sign on your arm and for frontlets between your eyes. And then God tells him, now let me tell you some facts about them. They should be black, they should be square, they should have parchments inside, they should have straps, etc. These things were passed down as a received tradition from Moses, who heard them directly from God. The next part of the oral law that we learned about last week is called derived, and these are laws that all that was passed down from Moses at Sinai were 13 rules. And they are the rules of derivation, okay? And they tell us how you can derive a law from the Torah. And the Talmud is full, or the oral law is full of lots of laws that are learned derived from the Torah based on these 13, they're called hermeneutic principles. Okay. And then finally you have what we can really call rabbinic law, which is legislation. The Torah gives the rabbis the ability to legislate when necessary. So take something, for example, like not eating chicken with milk, right? The rabbis lived at a time where they realized that meat and chicken are treated very similarly. They're both from an animal. They're both, the flesh of an animal that you're eating. And for people to differentiate between the two of them, when someone sees someone eating chicken and milk, they're probably going to assume you can eat meat and milk. So they lumped chicken in together with meat. And that's a legislation. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah. It wasn't received from Moses at Sinai. It wasn't derived from any verse in the Torah. It was just a legislation that was put out by the rabbis. Okay. All of these last 3 categories were preserved orally until the composition of the Mishnah. That moment is what I want to talk about today. The composition of the Mishnah. Because that is the first work to be written down of any sort of oral law. Okay? Now, right about now you might be thinking to yourself, okay, let me hear when. When was the Mishnah written? Probably it's going to have something to do with the advent of writing and the advent of engraving or something like that. The answer is no. Lay all that aside. It has nothing to do with that. The Torah was being written generation after generation, ink on parchment. Okay? from about 3,330 something years ago when Moses came down from Sinai, and he wrote the first 13 scrolls, and he put one in the ark of the temple, and then he took the other 12 and he gave one to each tribe, and from then on, many Torahs were written. So clearly writing was going on. So the fact that the written law was written and the oral law, all three of these bottom categories, received, derived, and legislated, the fact that they were all not written was not by chance. It was actually very, very intentional. The Tanakh text was always written down. The oral part of the tradition was always given over orally. And Ron, welcome. If I can, I know you weren't here last week. If I can ask you to read for us, please, text 1 about these written and oral boundaries and how it wasn't just by chance.
Material that was conveyed as a text may not be recited orally without a script, and material that was conveyed orally may not be recorded as text.
Okay, so until the writing of the Mishnah, until the compilation of the Mishnah, there was no writing down oral law, and there was no saying or written law by heart. The Rebbe, by the way, had this custom. If you ever listen to the Rebbe's public talks, I think it was 3 words. The Rebbe would never, or maybe finishing a verse, if the Rebbe was saying things from like quoting a verse from the Torah, the Rebbe would never complete the entire verse by heart. You're only supposed to read it inside. Why? Because that's the written law, and the oral law was supposed to be oral. Now, the obvious question we have now is why, right? Why would the Tanakh be exclusively written and the oral Torah be exclusively memorized? So the real question is, I guess here's another way of formulating this question. Why, if you have more to say, why not write it down? You gave me the 5 books of Moses. You gave me the 24 books. Beautiful. After the Tanakh, why would you then give me other, like, if you wanted tefillin to be square, if you want them to be black, if you want them to have straps, write it all down. You have a few more verses after the verse about binding them for a sign on your arm and frontlets between your eyes. Write down the details, right? Why would you pass it down orally? So one explanation that's given is that actually, even though we always talk about written being like, oh, the written law is perfect, right? Like something that's written, you see those words, you can't change those words, nobody can ever change those words, those are the words that were written. But actually, it's not very precise. Why? Because think, for example, about the Constitution. This is my favorite. You have to make 1,000 separations between the Constitution, which is not holy, it's just a document that America is founded on, and the Torah, which is obviously the Word of God. But having made that disclaimer, the Constitution is probably one of the most argued about texts that there ever was. And the reason for that is because the Constitution is missing an oral Constitution. So, take the Second Amendment. All those that are in favor of abolishing all guns from America, they look at the Second Amendment and they actually say, oh yeah, a militia, whatever. They have ways that in the Second Amendment they actually see it as a ban on people owning guns. And those that are more in favor of guns, the NRA and people like that, whatever, right? They take it and they uphold it and they take it way further than it should go, right? In other words, a written law can be twisted to whichever way. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. By twisted, I mean it can be translated and used and conveniently used to support the point that you want. But if you have an oral tradition, then you can be much more precise. I often tell people, like when they ask me certain types of questions, I'll tell them, like they email me with a question, and I'll tell them, hey, let's have a conversation about it. Particularly if it's of like an emotionally sensitive nature. Why? Because I can explain myself much better with words than I ever can with an email. No matter how lengthy, and no matter how precise, and no matter how long I labor on the choice of my words, text is text. It's limited to what the text is saying. Which is why, by the way, when oral tradition is passed down, right? So for example, let's say in 2 days from now, you're going to want to repeat this lesson from today to someone else. Right? Much more important than having the textbook in front of you is going to be the memory that you have of me teaching it. And you might use different words than I used to explain it. But you understood the concept, now you're using different words. The words are not as important as the way it's being transmitted. You get to be more precise because you're giving it over orally. The second reason that oral law is so important is because of the effort that you put into it. When a student puts in effort to retain something, which obviously in order to remember it and in order to process it, you need to put in a lot more effort. Right? I always say that that's one of the downsides I always feel with these lessons, and it depends who. But because these lessons are recorded, I always feel like people they listen to me, but it's like 75% listen to me. Worst case, I'll just check the recording. If I didn't understand something, I'll reverse it, I'll go back. right? When you're in a live lecture, you automatically pay very close attention to every word that the teacher is saying, and maybe you ask some questions, but it's you invest more effort. Now, what's the benefit to investing more effort, right? This is something that maybe in the 21st century we've lost track of. Why? Because we invest almost no effort in anything. Raise your hand if you can remember any phone numbers besides for your wife and your parents and your childhood home phone number. And probably none of us remember any phone numbers besides for that. And even those that we remember, it's because we were forced to, right? Because you were a child, you didn't have a cell phone or whatever. Right? We all know about this. In other words, when something requires less effort, what happens is there's less devotion. That's what I'm trying to point out. When there's less devotion, it's less a part of you. It's less important to you. Whereas when something is oral and you invest extra effort into memorizing it and listening to it and retaining it, so then automatically there's going to be more of a devotion to that text. So that would be a second reason. And the third reason, maybe not so PC, and I know this recording is going on YouTube, maybe I'm going to get some flack for this, but actually the third reason is this, and the sages suggest this is brought down in the Medrash Rabbah, that the Torah was preserved in an oral form so that it would not be accessible to the other nations of the world. Let me explain to you what I mean. Let me give you an example. There's many examples that could be given. By the way, the best example that could be given is last week's lesson, right? We had the whole beginning of last week's lesson was all about the burning of the Talmud, right? Why were they burning it? There were parts of it that they didn't like. Before it was written down, they didn't need to burn anything. I mean, they were burning Jews. It's a separate thing, right? But there was always persecution of Jews. But there was no Talmud to burn because it was being transmitted orally. You didn't offend anybody. And you didn't say there were things in there that they didn't like. But here's another point. The written Torah has been subject to something which till today I personally am offended by, which is that there's a group of people that they look at the written Torah and they say, oh, the written Torah, that is the old. And we have the new, which kind of amends or replaces the old. And that's offensive for many reasons, but it also reminds us that when something is orally being transmitted, there's no chance to say there's something new. If it's being orally transmitted by thousands of people, millions of people, a whole nation, you can't really come and say, oh, that whole oral tradition is wrong. I'm telling you the oral tradition, millions of people remember it. What are you going to do? You can't argue with that. First of all, they couldn't even access it. They couldn't even access it. And even if they could access it, you can't really disprove that. Whereas a text, you can make a new text, and that text can become popular, and you can say, see, so the new text is the real one, the old one is wrong. Anyways, just some explanations for this point about why oral law is so important. Okay. Now, towards the end of the 2nd century, the sages of Israel made a dramatic decision to compose a written record of the oral Torah, and this book is what is called the Mishnah, and it is the topic of today's lesson. I want to examine some of the historical background, like the backdrop upon which the Mishnah is written, because I think that will be very helpful to understanding why it was done. For starters, on page 37, you can see our next key term, the rabbis of the Mishnah. That means any rabbi that is quoted in any Mishnah. There are over 120 rabbis quoted, as we mentioned last week. They are called Tanaim, in singular a Tana, in the plural Tanaim. It literally means a teacher or a repeater, but what it's a reference to is a sage whose teachings are recorded in the Mishnah. Now, what I'd like to do in today's lesson. Okay, so we start off with two basic facts about the Mishnah, which is who wrote it, who is quoted in it, whose wisdom is it, the Tanaim, when was it at the end of the 2nd century. What I'd like to do in the time of today's lesson, which means we have about 70 minutes left, I'd like to spend about half that time covering the history of the Mishnah, maybe not even half, maybe a third of that time covering the history of the Mishnah, the historical background, and then why it was necessary and what changed with the writing of the Mishnah. And then in the last 2/3 of the lesson, what I'd like to do is take you on a tour of a sample Mishnah so you get a full scope, an idea of what a Mishnah looks like and what a Mishnah is trying to accomplish. Okay? Let's start with the history. And for the history, I want to start with an interesting fact. Okay? If you take a look, just gather all the names. Right? Today we can do this. Take a computer, Control F, give me a name. How many names are quoted in the Mishnah? Go through the entire Mishnah and tell me how many names are quoted in there. Now, then tell me the years for each of those people that are quoted there. You will find something fascinating. Obviously, all of the rabbis quoted in the Mishnah are before the Mishnah was compiled, because the Mishnah was compiled summarizing the wisdom of all of these rabbis. It's over a period of about 300 years, okay? And it starts somewhere very, very specific. It starts from a sage whose name was Hillel. Raise your hand if you've heard of Hillel. Pretty famous sage. He's got a lot of Jewish centers on campus named after him, right? He's got a lot of Jewish academies named after him, the Hillel Academies, right? Hillel was one of the greatest Jewish sages, definitely. If you're going to name Jewish sages, he's probably from the top 10, top 20 for sure. And before Hillel, literally 0.1%, 0.01% of the sages mentioned in the Talmud lived before the time of Hillel. I think there's one quote from somebody who lived in the times of the prophets, his name was Haggai, right? Now, most of the sages are from post-Hillel. 99.99% are sages that lived after Hillel's time until the compilation of the Mishnah, which is a period of about 300 years. Now, why am I pointing this out to you? The reason I'm pointing this out to you is because you have to understand that you are talking about 1,300 years since Sinai. Okay? So there's 1,000 years post-Sinai where there's no disputes, there's no rabbis, there's no names being mentioned. Not because there weren't rabbis teaching things. The Mishnah only names rabbis if there's a dispute. Okay? So it's almost as if before Hillel, there was a complete consensus. And after Hillel, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of dispute, and that's why names are mentioned. And this is when I want to introduce another key term. Okay, the key term that I want to mention now is something called the Stam Mishnah. A Stam Mishnah means a law that is mentioned in the Mishnah, but it's unmarked. It's unattributed to anyone. It's just said as a statement. And by the way, many Mishnahs exist like this. Okay, now there's a lot of disputes. I shouldn't say there aren't disputes. There are many disputes. In fact, if you want to talk chapters, there's actually only one chapter in the entire Mishnah that doesn't have any disputes listed in it. Okay, but that's chapters. If you go down, divide it into Mishnahs, many Mishnahs are what we call a Stam Mishnah. And especially if you take a certain statement in the Mishnah, very often the statement in the Mishnah is unmarked. Why is it unmarked? It's unmarked because there was halachic consensus. In other words, it was never disputed or was resolved. So now where we arrive is at this interesting fact that it's where I really want to ask why. Okay, what does why mean? Why means why for 1,000 years. It's almost as if for 1,000 years the rabbis never argued. I'm laughing because it's a joke. Obviously the rabbis argued. So what happened to all of those disputes that happened over 1,000 years? And then for the next 300 years, the 300 years immediately preceding the Mishnah, you get so many disputes. This rabbi says this Hillel says this, and Shammai says that, and this one says this, and this one says that. All these different disputes. Why? Now, in order to answer the question of why, we only need to explain one of them. We can either choose to explain why it was that for 300 years after Hillel, there were so many disputes, or we can look for an explanation for why the 1,000 years before Hillel, from Sinai to Hillel, there were no disputes, right? Now, which of the two is more of an anomaly? Anybody? What is crazier? Is it crazier that for 1,000 years there were no disputes, or that all of a sudden, starting one day for 300 years, there were disputes?
Crazy that there were 1,000 years that there weren't any.
Thank you. We all know that if you have two Jews, you have three opinions, right? But it's not even just Jews. Just put a whole bunch of academics in a room. Automatically, you're gonna have multiple opinions. All right, you won't get three for every two, but you'll get a lot of different opinions. How did they manage to go 1,000 years with consensus?
Was it consensus, or no one spoke up that they didn't have consensus?
Hold on. We're about to explore it. But first, Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, we skipped the text. It was text 2, which talks about clearly anonymous. Go ahead, Phil. We're on page 38.
The ancient Torah scholars did not publish the names of the authors of particular Torah teachings, with the exception of the names of a head or deputy of the Sanhedrin, because among them there was no controversy. They had clarity of knowledge regarding all Torah concepts.
Okay, so for 1,000 years there's clarity about all Torah concepts, and all of a sudden a dispute begins. And the obvious question is how and when. So Shari says maybe they were all peaceful vegans. No, I'm not going with that. Okay, text 3 is going to explain it to us. There was a system in place, it turns out, that was very useful. Elise, do you have your book?
Yes.
Okay, so if you can read for us text 3, resolving doubt. This comes to us from Maimonides, and he explains to us what the system was for 1,000 years, and this is going to bring us to the history of the Mishnah, what changed that they couldn't use this system. Go ahead, Elise.
Okay. As long as the Supreme Sanhedrin functioned, there were never prolonged differences of opinion among the Jewish people. Rather, any Jewish individual who developed a doubt regarding any law would simply inquire of the Jewish court of their city. If that local court was aware of the solution, it would inform that individual. If not, both the questioner and the court or its agents would ascend to Jerusalem and pose the dilemma to the greater court that held session on the Temple Mount. If that court knew the answer, it would supply it. If not, the entire group would proceed together to the higher court that held session at the entrance to the temple courtyard. If it knew the solution, it would supply it. If not, they would all proceed to the chamber of hewn stone in which the Supreme Sanhedrin held court and pose the dilemma to the Sanhedrin. If the resolution of this matter that was unresolved by all the previous courts was known to the Supreme Sanhedrin, they would provide the decision immediately. If the matter was unclear to the Supreme Sanhedrin, its members would deliberate on the spot, debating back and forth among themselves until they reached a uniform decision. If they were unable to reach a consensus decision, a vote would be held and the majority position would be adopted. The Sanhedrin would then inform the entire assemblage that they had posed the dilemma. This
Okay.
is the halacha.
They would say, this is the halacha, this is the law. Thank you, Elise. The procedure that's being described here by Maimonides ensured that in the cases where disputes among sages did emerge, and trust me, they emerged, they were always settled almost immediately. And this functioned smoothly for about 1,300 years. Now, I want to say something. I want you to think about what those 1,300 years were, okay? Because and this is I'm going to give you a really quick history, and I think most of you are familiar with this history. The Jewish people received the Torah at Sinai. Where are they for the next 40 years?
In the desert.
Thank you, in the desert. In last week's Torah portion, we learned about a character whose name was Yitro. He was Moses' father-in-law, and he introduced, essentially, the mother of this system that you're reading about from Maimonides. He realizes that Moses is answering a lot of questions, and he's basically, from the morning till the night, we just read this in last week's Torah portion, for those of you that were there, from the morning till the night, he's busy answering questions. So he says, let's make a system. And he said, let's make one judge for every 10 people, another judge for every 100 people, another judge for every 1,000 people, another judge for every 10,000 people, etc., on and on and on and on. And he says, let them climb the ranks. If you have a small little question, you go to the guy who's in charge of your minion, in charge of your 10 people, right? And you ask the question. If it's an easy question, he'll be able to resolve it. If it's harder, it goes up and climbs the ranks, right? Similar to the appellate, the court system in the United States, until it reaches the Supreme Court. That's a weird way of saying it. The appellate court system is probably built off this biblical version, but okay, either way. Now, this system was started by Yitro almost immediately after the giving of the Torah at Sinai, right? Because as the Jews were all studying. Now, also the Jews are all in one place, right? That's an additional fact. So you have 3 factors so far. Number 1 is the Jews have a system to settle disputes. Number 2, the Jews are all in one physical location. And number 3, which I think is also very important, is that it's pretty much a time of peace. There might have been the odd little war here or there, and there is. Torah tells us about wars that there were. But for the most part, those 40 years were a time of peace. The Jewish people were traveling in the desert. They weren't fighting wars. They certainly weren't being persecuted by other nations. Okay, then they come to Israel for 400 years before the first temple. Same thing. Every once in a while, a little war here, a little war there. But the Jews have control of the land of Israel. They're ruling the land of Israel. They're living under their own rulership. Beautiful. Then comes the first temple, the most peaceful time to date in Jewish history, 400 years under beginning King Solomon, and then the rest of the first temple, pretty peaceful times. Again, yes, a war here, yes, a war there, a bad king, a corrupt king, whatever. The Jews are still in control of the land of Israel. They're serving God in the first temple. Beautiful. Little brief period of exile, 70 years. Things are starting to get rocky. Then comes the second temple, right? Right, so the temple is destroyed after 400 years, 410 years, I think it is exactly. And then there's a period of 70 years of exile, now the second temple. About halfway through the second temple is when things really start to get rocky. Why? What happens then? So for this, we are going to turn our attention to the video screens.
The ancient land of Israel first fell under Roman rule in the year 63 BCE, with Pompey's successful siege of Jerusalem. The next century and a half was a particularly traumatic period of Jewish history. Judea continued to function as a monarchy, but it was no longer independent. Judea became a client kingdom of the Roman Republic, and its monarchs were Rome-appointed puppets. Herod, perhaps the most infamous of the client kings, was installed in 36 BCE. Herod was the descendant of an Idumean convert to Judaism, who managed to curry favor with the rulers of the Roman Empire. He married the princess of the royal family of Israel, and eventually reigned over Israel on behalf of the Roman Empire. During the early phase of his rule, Herod massacred many of the leading Jewish sages, seeing their authority as a threat to his own. He also massacred the entire Maccabean family, including his own Maccabean wife and children. Despite the horrors, upheavals, and deprivations suffered by the Jews of Judea during this time, many continued to invest their efforts into studying, clarifying, and perpetuating God's holy Torah. Among them were two famous co-leaders of the sages, Hillel and Shammai. They and their students struggled mightily to navigate the turbulence of Roman subjugation. Following the death of Hillel, his grandson Rabban Gamliel served as both spiritual and communal leader of the Jewish people. He worked tirelessly to prevent the Jews from descending into direct armed conflict with Rome, but it was not an easy task. Roman excesses repeatedly drove the people to the brink, but on each occasion, disaster was avoided. Finally, during the reign of the Emperor Nero in approximately 68 CE, the dam broke. Assorted factions of Jewish fighters rebelled against their Roman oppressors, dragging the entire land of Israel into merciless war. By the war's end, the Jerusalem temple lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had met violent deaths, and hundreds of thousands more were carted off into slavery. But the Jews were resilient. The surviving population flung itself into the task of recovery, hampered, as before, by relentless Roman persecution. Despite devastations and defeats, the Jews lay down their swords only temporarily. Fresh tensions broke to the fore when a Jewish leader named Bar Kokhba emerged and led a second massive Judean uprising against Rome. Bar Kokhba achieved astonishing early successes that shook Rome badly. He was acclaimed by some of the greatest sages of that era to be the Jewish Messiah, but in time, Rome prevailed once more, and the Jewish army fell at Beitar. This time, the consequences for Judea were unbearably severe. Almost the entire population of southern Israel was destroyed, and the burned and brutalized land was left bereft of its people.
These 2 centuries, from the year 63 BCE, I don't know if any of you were following on the top, and it was a little blocked, but there was a bar at the top. I'll link the video in the after lesson email, and you'll be able to see it. But there was a bar at the top where they were following along. It was from 63 BCE until about 135 CE. Okay, so roughly 200 years. During that period, there were serious challenges. This was the first time that there were very serious challenges to the functioning of the halachic system. Even when there wasn't a direct threat necessarily to their lives, the Jewish people had other issues. So, for example, the first sages to be dealing with this, no surprise, are Hillel and his contemporary, a man by the name of Shammai. Okay, when Hillel comes from Babylon, there was already a functioning shul, a functioning beis medrash, a house of study, under a rabbi named Shammai. Now, Hillel could have just joined Shammai in the same beis medrash, which is what Jews used to do before that, by the way. Thousands of students would sit. I mean, this is a baby class compared to what was going on then, right? The problem is they now had a different issue. Why? Because the more you're going to start condensing, becoming more and more, the Romans are going to start to view this as a threat. So Hillel opens up his own base medrash, his own house of study. And this is happening over and over again. From then on, this happens. It's not a consolidation of everybody studying together under one person, under one great sage of the time, and anybody who wants can challenge him, and then there's like checks and balances, etc., and they come to consensuses with him and with the Sanhedrin. Instead, you have this issue. There's different houses of study. There's different conclusions. There's no consensus. There's no voting with the Sanhedrin. Not at the beginning, not at the end, none of it. And as a result, we end up with the first two schools that do a tremendous amount of disputing, which is the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, in Hebrew known as Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. They argued over the number of candles to light on Hanukkah and which Hallel prayers to recite on Passover. They argued over the minimum value of the wedding ring at chuppah and over the proper way to praise a bride at her wedding. They argued over the order of the prayers to be said during Kiddush on Friday night and over which foods might be used to prepare a dinner for a festival. Over and over and over again, as you go through the Mishnah, you will find Beis Hillel says as follows, and Beis Shammai says as follows. Okay, following the destruction of the temple, the sages made every effort to resolve these disputes, and they came to a lot of resolutions. Eventually, it was determined that in almost all matters of halacha, we should follow the view of Beis Hillel. Right? Beautiful. This happened. You might be familiar with this. This is after the destruction of the Second Temple. So now you're at 70 CE, in the middle of these 200 years. Right? In the middle of these tumultuous 2 centuries. They're doing their best, right? But I want you to understand what it took for them to be able to do that. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had to literally sneak out of the siege of Jerusalem, pretending to be dead, as if it was his funeral and they were taking him out of the city in order to be buried. He came, he met a certain Roman legion, but I don't want to get into all details of the story, but basically he managed to secure that they should pull together a group of rabbis in Yavna, in a city called Yavna, and that's where they made these consensus. Is that the consensi? I don't know what the plural is of consensus. But the unceasing troubles of Rome made it very difficult to keep this kind of thing going. You couldn't just continue to gather. They hated this kind of thing, and they kept cracking down on it. New questions were constantly coming up, and different sages were coming to different conclusions, which was also happening 500 years before that. Just then they had a system in place, and now that system was being threatened and being challenged. During the second revolt, right, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the sages faced the very real possibility of the complete loss of the oral tradition. And we got this interesting story in the Talmud of an old sage by the name of Rabbi Akiva. Raise your hand if you've heard of Rabbi Akiva. Right, another sage from the times of the Mishnah. Excuse me. And this is for the second and less than a century, Jewish rebels had risen up. We just saw about it in the video, under Bar Kokhba, against the mighty Roman Empire, and the Romans had vanquished them. The battle had raged for years, and it cost the Romans heavy casualties, and ended in obviously the devastating Jewish defeat, which we saw in the video. Hundreds of thousands were murdered, countless were enslaved, and the entire central and southern region of Israel, what we know today as Judea, right, was largely depopulated. Who was the emperor now? A fellow by the name of Hadrian. By the way, if you want to follow along with me, on page 47 in your book, you have like a graph that goes through this. We've already done the first one, and we're moving on into the second one. Okay? Actually, we're in the third one already. We're almost at Rabbi Akiva. Okay? So by this point, the Roman Emperor Hadrian had enough, and once and for all, he was determined to eradicate Judaism. And as many other anti-Semites before him and after him, he realized that the entire thing was hinged on their Torah. And a law was established in Israel banning the teaching of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva lived during this era, and he stood in his older age and taught publicly to hundreds of students. He knew he was risking his life, and eventually they caught him and they did kill him. He was murdered by Roman forces under Emperor Hadrian. But before they did so, one of his colleagues challenged him. They said, Rabbi Akiva, what gives you the right to put your life in jeopardy just to teach Torah? And Rabbi Akiva shared the famous story. Phil, if you can read it for us, please. It's text 4 about a fish out of water.
Rabbi Akiva said, let me relate a parable to what is this phenomenon compared to a fox that strolls along a river and notices that fish have gathered and are repeatedly racing from one side of the river to the other. The fox inquires, what are you fleeing? The fish reply, we're fleeing from nets that humans are casting for us, suggests the fox, would you like to ascend to dry land to escape the nets? We can live together up here. Just as my ancestors resided with your ancestors, the fish retorted, aren't you the creatures they describe as the cleverest animal? You're not clever, you are a fool. If we are afraid for our survival while we are in the water, our natural habitat that sustains our very life, then in a habitat that causes our death, we would be all the more certain of dying. The same is true of us Jews. We are actively engaged in studying the Torah that is described as your life and your length of days, and nevertheless, we fear for our lives. If we were to go ahead and desist from its study, we would have far greater grounds to fear for our survival.
Thank you, Phil. As I mentioned, Rabbi Akiva was eventually arrested by the Romans and cruelly executed. We actually read about his execution as part of the recounting of the 10 martyrs that we do on Yom Kippur, about how they flayed his... Anyways, without getting into all details, but his sacrifice helped to preserve the Jewish nation. As he had so beautifully observed, for him to stand and teach Torah meant that he might die. But for him to not study Torah meant that he would be killing himself. And Rabbi Akiva's prediction, by the way, of this national death of the Jewish people if they don't study Torah, actually it was no exaggeration. The oral law itself was under threat, and it was at danger of being lost forever. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy period. And in the middle of this period, after Rabbi Akiva, just a few short generations later, arises a man, a great leader among the Jewish people, who was from an illustrious family, and his name was Rabbi Yehuda. Today we know him as Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi means Rabbi Yehuda the prince, or the president, or what have you. And we call him that because he was a leader among the Jewish people. And he came, you can see on page 43, from a long line of rabbis, going back to the original Hillel, which we discussed, who was the first one to suffer this kind of persecution. His father was Rabbi Shimon, who led the recovery from the Hadrianic persecutions. His grandfather was Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne, who led the recovery following the temple's destruction. Right? Like, this was a line of rabbis that was doing their best to lead the Jewish people during very, very tumultuous times. As you can see, going from Hillel the Great to his son Shimon, the son of Hillel, to his son Gamliel the Elder, to his son Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the martyred, to his son Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne, to his son Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel II, and finally till Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who we fondly call Rebbe. So he came from an illustrious lineage, but perhaps more importantly, he also had peace with Roman rulers. Let me explain. There's a story that is told in the Talmud about the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was born. So remember, he's born during this time when Torah observance is outlawed by Hadrian, and and one of the things that was outlawed was circumcision. You were not allowed to circumcise your son. Now Rabbi Shimon was going to have none of that, and he circumcised his son, who later became Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, this great Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, and he circumcised his son at 8 days old. And he was reported to the government. And eventually, I don't remember the details of it, but basically, he was told to come before whatever it is, the Roman legion, whoever it was, right? Whatever, maybe all the way in front of the emperor, I don't know, to display his son, to see that he had circumcised his son, and then he was going to be put to death. And on the way there, he stopped at an inn. And two Romans, a young couple, who had just had a baby, asked him what's going on. And he explained to them what's going on, and they felt this was cruel. And so they said, why don't we switch our babies for this presentation? You can take our baby. Our baby was born the exact same day that your baby was born. Take him to the emperor or whatever, to the legion, and the legion will see that he's not circumcised, and then you come back, and we'll swap back. And that's indeed what they did. That son, that baby, was Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor during the time, later on when they grew up, right? Marcus Aurelius became the emperor of Rome, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi became the leader of the Jewish people. So in addition to him coming from an illustrious lineage, he also had it was a very calm time in the middle of these storms, because we'll soon see that after this, it was the Mishnah came just in the nick of time. But there was peace with the Roman rulers during his time. And finally, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is an amazing individual in his own right. Ron, if you can read for us about him, I would appreciate it. It's text 5, Maimonides' description of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the great teacher. Page 44.
He was unique in his generation, singular in his era, filled with all the pleasant and desirable good character traits, to the extent that he earned the great merit whereby all the people of his own generation referred to him reverently. Rabbeinu Hakadosh, O holy teacher, his name was Yehuda. He was entirely complete in wisdom and virtue. In fact, our sages stated that we have not seen such a combination of Torah and greatness in a single individual from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moses, until Rabbi, the teacher. He was perfect in piety and humility, and he distanced himself from material pleasures. He was eloquent in speech, and his knowledge of the Holy Tongue, Biblical Hebrew, was so far beyond all other people that the sages would learn the meaning of unfamiliar words in Scripture from the terms used in casual conversation by Rabbi Yehuda's personal servants and attendants. Wow.
Thank you very much. And it was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, along with his contemporaries, who made the decision, his colleagues, that they made the decision to take advantage of the relative peace during their time and reach a verdict on many of the disputes that happened to their date. In other words, they were basically starting off just doing the same thing they were doing in Yavna. Remember when I told you about the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai? They had a moment after the destruction of the second temple, and they tried to reach a consensus and everything that was discussed between them. So the first thing that they started to do was, let's make a halachic consensus. So he gathered, I don't think it was 71 sages, but he gathered a group of sages. I think probably the most important thing to state is that there were Republicans and Democrats in the audience. In other words, he made sure he had representatives of all. I'm sorry for using such a coarse example, but he made sure he had a representative of all the different opinions that there would have been on all different sides from halacha, from the disputes that there were to that date. And the first thing he was trying to do was create a halacha consensus. But then they took their project much further. They made the decision to create an official Torah or oral Torah text for universal use. Now, by the way, I should mention that there were other formulas for how to remember the oral Torah. Trust me, they weren't just moving along. As you study the Talmud, you see that every student had his way of remembering the oral Torah, right? And each one of them remembered whatever they remembered. But it was more collectively that it was all being remembered. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his colleagues decide that they're going to create an official oral Torah text for universal use. Now, this was a very big deal, and they didn't take it lightly, because remember we said earlier that you weren't supposed to write down the oral Torah, and there were all these reasons why. But they basically made a decision that it's better to save it than to not have it at all, because it was at risk of being lost entirely. Finally, the last thing they decided to do was to write it down. Okay. The reasons for this obviously were because of these three issues. You can see it on page 45. The reasons for composing the Mishnah were, number one, because there were so many disputes, therefore they wanted a halachic consensus. Number two, because there was a greater and greater risk of inaccuracies, because everybody was studying in different study halls and different cities and different countries, etc. And they're becoming more and more dispersed, right? So therefore, they decided to create an official Torah text, and finally they decided to write it down in order that the chain of transmission would no longer be on the brink of severance, on the brink of being destroyed entirely, of being lost forever. Okay. The sages at that time must have felt the pressing need for the Mishnah, even in their time. Now, as you go through history, you start to see that the urgency built upon itself. Like if you put yourself in a time which is around the end of the 2nd century CE, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is living, you can imagine that it's not just that they had suffered 2 centuries of Roman rule, and now they're kind of coming out of it, but they see that there's been ups and downs throughout Jewish history. So they don't know how much longer till the next down, right? And that's why he chooses to write it down. Let's see how Maimonides describes this. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 6 on page 46, the writing motivations of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi as described by Maimonides. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Elise. We're on page 46, writing motivations.
Okay, why did Rabbi Beinu HaKadosh make such a radical move instead of perpetuating the status quo? He saw that serious Torah students were consistently dwindling in number, that fresh calamities were constantly striking the Jewish people, and the oppressive Roman Empire was spreading throughout the world and becoming even more powerful. That the Jewish people were forced to wander far apart and dispersed to the farthest ends of civilization. He therefore composed a single compendium that would be available to everyone so that the laws could be studied quickly and not be forgotten.
Thank you, Elise. Now, as it turns out, Rabbi Yehuda's foresight was extremely prophetic. Because about a century after he committed the Mishnah to writing, the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, adopted Christianity, and that from that time the persecution of the Jewish people in Israel increased terribly. I mean, and from then for a very long time. Anyways, so Rabbi Yehuda, and you can see all of this summarized on page 47, the whole history of it. Okay, but I think about now we are ready for an actual tour of the Mishnah. Yes? Okay, let's go into it. First of all, what is the origin of the word Mishnah? Okay, why does he call his compilation of the oral law? Wouldn't it have been better to call it Torah Shebal Peh, right? The oral Torah? No, he calls it Mishnah. Why Mishnah? For two reasons. Number one, the word Mishnah has the word Shana in it, which I know many of you know as meaning the word year in Hebrew. But actually, and this is why the word Shana means year, Shana means to repeat or to review. Okay? And in Aramaic, the same word, which Shana translates to Tana in Aramaic, this is not the only word that's very similar in Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic does a lot of linguistic spin-offs of Hebrew. The word Shana and Tana basically mean to review or to teach. Okay. The second meaning of the word Mishnah is from the word Sheni, which means second. What is the Mishnah second to? Of course, to the Tanakh, right? To the written law. It is the second book, if you will. The second part of the Torah, there was the written law, and now there's the writing down of the oral law. And that's the origin of the word Mishnah. Okay. You can see that key term on page 49. I know we've been discussing it. It's even the title of today's lesson, but it definitely needs to be a key term. It's the text that serves as the initial official record of the laws of the Torah's oral tradition. Rabbi Yehuda and his colleagues labored over the text, making sure that every single word was precise. They took this text, their compilation, and they had to set it up in a specific way. By the time they were done, it was around 200,000, approximately 200,000 words, which is the size of two large novels. It is approximately 4,200 Mishnahs, which means kind of like paragraphs or statements. It's approximately 500, split into approximately 525 chapters across 63 tractates, and they divided it into 6 categories, which they called the orders of the Mishnah. In Hebrew, the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. The Shisha Sidrei, as they are known colloquially, are the 6 orders, and they are shortened, as with many things in Hebrew, to a Rashi Tevot, right, where it's an acronym and each letter represents a different word. So Shisha Sidrei is Shin Samach, which together makes the word Shas. And that is how it is known today. If you ask any Torah scholar, how much of Shas have you learned? It means how much of the Mishnah, usually with the Talmud, with the Gemara, the Talmud, which is the source, the topic of next week's lesson, that explains it and that analyzes it, right? But it means how much of it have you gone through? If somebody is making a Siyum Hashas, a conclusion of the entire Shas, which means Shisha Sidre, the 6 orders, it means that they've gone through the entire Talmud and now they're having a celebration to conclude it. I remember my grandfather doing that on multiple occasions, I think at least 2 or 3 times in his lifetime, that I can remember that he concluded the entire Shas. What are the Shisha Sidre? What are the 6 orders of the Mishnah? You can see them on page 50. The menorah right? Which of course is the beacon of light that there was in the temple, and from it, light was supposed to emanate to the entire world, is also representative of the light of the Torah, which is represented in the physical imagery of the menorah. The center branch, of course, right? Just to clarify, we're talking about the menorah in the temple, not the menorah we light on Hanukkah, which has 8 branches, or 9 if you count the Shamish, which is to commemorate an 8-day holiday, right? We're talking about the menorah in the temple, which had 7 branches. 1 in the center, 6 coming out of it. The center branch, of course, is the written Torah. That's the anchor of the entire Torah. And the 6 branches coming out of it are representative of the Shisha Sidre, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. You can see them. They are called Zeraim, Moed, Nashim, Nezikin, Kadshim, and Taharot. And their English translations are right underneath. Seeds, appointed time, women, damages, sacraments, and purities. The topics are also underneath. So let's do an interesting exercise, shall we? If you can turn to page 51, what I'd like you to do is keep page 50 and 51 open together in front of you, right? And what we're going to try to do is everybody unmute, please. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try and put everything that I say, or that's listed in this list here on page 51, into the right category. You can take out a pen if you like. You can do this together with me. The first 6 will be the obvious ones. The laws forbidding the use, and these are lots of laws that are Torah laws, and they need to fit somewhere into these 6 categories, right? They're very broad, these categories. So we have to fit them all in. The first 6 are going to fit very obviously. The next 6, what I'm trying to show you is that even if they had a law which didn't fit in so neatly into one of the 6, they connected it in some way and put it into that one. And then in this way, they made 6 categories. Let's go through the 6 orders of the Mishnah, shall we? Elise, the laws forbidding the use of the fruit of a tree during its first 3 years. In Hebrew, this is called orla. Wait, what? Come again?
Zeraim.
Zeraim. Hold on, why is my slide not working? Very good. Zeraim, it goes into the agricultural laws. Very obviously, it's agriculture. Okay, Ron. Laws governing the delivery of a bill of divorce via an agent. Where's that going to go into?
Let's see. Nashim.
Very good. Nashim, the laws of marriage and divorce. Phil, a list of the psalms that were sung by the Levites during the Holy Temple's daily service. Which order will you be able to find that in?
Kochim.
Very good. Kodshim, the temple service. Till anybody else unmutes, I'll keep going through the 3 of you. Okay. Elise, number 4, laws concerning the red heifer. You got to have the laws of the red heifer, right? Where does that go?
Kodshim.
Very good. No, not Kodshim.
Oh.
The laws of the red heifer are the ashes of the red heifer were mixed with water and sprinkled on people to make them pure. So it goes into the laws of ritual purity. Ron, the laws concerning the Passover Seder?
Moed.
Very good. Moed, Shabbat and holidays. Number 6, Phil, the laws concerning the obligation to return lost property to its owner. Where's that going to go?
Nezikin.
Thank you. That's every lawyer's favorite. Civil and criminal law. Okay, let's do some more complicated ones. Elise, use your imagination.
Laws governing the portion of the Torah to be read on Shabbat and holidays.
Where do you think that goes?
Moed?
It does go in Moed. The reason for it is because what happens is in Megillah, in the tractate that talks about Purim and reading the Megillah, it talks about when to read the Megillah, and then the Mishnah just goes a little off topic and says, let's talk about when to read the Torah portion. Very good. So that's Moed. Number 8, Ron, the laws of vows. Where would you put them?
Nezikim.
No. Try again.
Then it would be in, let's see, these are the balls about.
Use your imagination.
Zeraim.
No, it goes in Nashim, marriage and divorce. Why? Because very often vows are a source of strife between a man and woman, and therefore that's where it ends up fitting in, right? Think about it. I'm sure this never happened to you, but in theory, if someone says, we just spent a week with my in-laws, I vow I will never go back to their house ever again, right? That kind of thing. You can see it happening. All right, number 9. Phil, you want to give it a try? Laws governing interactions between Jews and idolaters. Where do you think it lands?
Nezikim.
It does go in Nezikin. The reason is because Nezikin includes all the laws that relate to criminal activities, and idol worship is considered a criminal activity from a Torah perspective, and then that leads to a conversation about interaction between Jews who don't serve idols and non-Jews who do serve idols. Elise, you want to try another one? Number 10, a discussion of the identity of the books of Scripture to be considered part of the Tanakh. The canonization of Tanakh. Where is that from?
Kodshim?
There's no way you were going to get this one. It goes in taharot, which means ritual purity. It has a lot to do with the fact that back in the day there were certain foods that contracted purity and impurity, and then the Torah scrolls also were kept in the same place because they didn't contract. So they made a law that if you touch a Torah scroll, you become impure because they didn't want people touching. Anyways, that's why it lands over there. Number 11.
Under what? It's under
taharot, ritual impurity. Ron, you want to try 11? Laws regarding the prohibition of mixing milk and meat?
Let's see. Mixing and meat. Milk and meat. No. Marriage and divorce. No.
I don't think there's any way you're going to get
Zeraim?
No. Good guess, but it goes in kachim. Kachim, because the explanation is that the order of kachim contains the laws that govern the animal sacrifices in the temple, right? The authors of the Mishnah decided to include a tractate on the laws that govern the slaughter of animals for regular consumption, together with slaughtering for temple services, right? And then from that, the kosher slaughter of animals, so it ended up with the kosher laws of milk and meat. Last one. Let's try the last one. Number 12. Anybody? Phil.
Kochim.
Daily prayers. Where do they go?
Kochim.
Nope. Zeraim. Why? Because agriculture leads to the laws of blessings, like which blessings you would make on which agriculture, like which blessing you make on fruit and which blessing you make on, and then eventually that leads to blessings, leads to prayers. So you can see that does everything fit in beautifully? No, but if you make them very broad categories, you can find somewhere for everything. Okay, so to summarize, where are we? Who is quoted in the Mishnah? It is the Tanaim, right? The end, the rabbis, the sages from Hillel until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. When was it compiled? At the end of the 2nd century. What is it? It's a record of the oral Torah. And now I want to get to how it is written. It is written as one of the most concise texts I have ever seen in my life. Okay? So what we're going to do now, for the remaining, how long do we have now? 25 minutes, is we're going to read a Mishnah, okay? And then we're going to read it over. We're going to read it over. We're going to read it over. And each time we read it, I'm going to show you different points that are unique about this. I'd like to try to make 5 points in total about the Mishnah that should be fascinating to you. And it will give you a lot of insight into the style, the linguistic style, and the way that Rabbi Yehuda and his colleagues put together the Mishnah. Okay? So we're going to start with Phil. If you can please read for us this Mishnah. It's a sample Mishnah. You might recognize the beginning of it, because last week when we needed to quote a random example, we used this as a random example, right? When I was trying to show you the diversity of the Talmud. So we did 4 different texts. Do you guys remember that? And 3 of them were law and 1 of them wasn't, right? So this was one of the ones we quoted, but here you're going to get the full Mishnah. And then I would like to point out 5 different points about this. Okay, let's dive into it. Phil, when you're ready, text 7, Passover laws, page 53.
We must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover from close to the time for reciting the Mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. Even the most destitute person in the Jewish nation should not eat unless he is reclining. He should not be provided with less than 4 cups of wine, even if he is being supplied by the public food bank. When they pour him his first cup of wine, according to Beit Shammai, he should first recite the blessing over the festival, then the blessing over the wine. According to the Beit Hillel, he should first recite the blessing over the wine and then the blessing over the festival.
Thank you. One of the reasons we chose this Mishnah, it's actually 2 Mishnahs, by the way, but one of the reasons we chose this Mishnah is because and this comes from Tractate Pesachim, right? From the tractate that talks about Passover. It's going to be in Seder Moed, the order which talks about Shabbat and holidays, right? And it's chapter 10, Mishnah 1 and Mishnah 2. Now, Dave, one of the reasons that we chose this one is because it describes the Passover Seder. You've been to a Passover Seder, Dave? Okay. I'd like you to unmute yourself. I have a question for you. What is missing? If this is a book of Jewish law, please do me a favor. Read for me the first paragraph again. Phil just read the whole Mishnah. Can you please read to me just the first paragraph that's in blue on the screen in front of you? And tell me what is missing here. What is the Mishnah assuming that you know?
We must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover, from close to the time of reciting the Mincha prayers until the darkness has fallen.
Okay. The day of Passover, this year Passover is going to be on Saturday night. On Saturday afternoon, you should not be eating anything from the time of Mincha prayers, which is the afternoon prayers, around 3 o'clock and on. You shouldn't be eating. Okay, beautiful. What is glaringly missing from here? It's almost as if this starts in the middle of a sentence. What's missing from this statement?
Refrain from eating.
This whole Mishnah is talking about the Passover Seder, right? All these paragraphs are talking about the Passover Seder. It doesn't say anywhere here that you have to eat dinner on the 14th day of Passover in the evening, on the 15th, in other words, the beginning of the 15th day of Passover. It doesn't say that anywhere, which I personally am offended by because it's my birthday. I would like at least that the Mishnah should say that you should eat dinner that night, right? Okay, if not dinner, at least tell me you should eat matzah that night. None of that is said there. You should have a dinner on Seder night is not mentioned in the Mishnah anywhere. This is where it would be. It's not here. That you should have matzah on Passover Seder night, not mentioned in the Mishnah. This is where it would be, and it's not here. Does anybody want to hazard a guess why Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his colleagues did not put this in the Mishnah? Why would they assume that you know that knowledge already? Give you a hint. Remember, the word Mishnah comes from the Hebrew word sheni, which means second.
Because it's in the Torah.
Thank you very much. It is in the written Torah. And this gives us the first observation that I want to make about the Mishnah. The Mishnah always starts with the second step. When the Mishnah starts to talk about tefillin, trust me, it doesn't say you have to put on tefillin. Maimonides does, by the way. When Maimonides talks about this 1,000 years later, 800 years later, his job is to try to give you a compendium or a codification of all law. So he starts off saying, every Jew on the 15th day of Passover has to have a Seder. A Seder is a dinner, and at a dinner you have to have matzah. And then he starts off in the beginning. The Mishnah is not trying to do that. The Mishnah is, first of all, a very concise text, but also a text that is very clearly self-identifying as the sequel. The oral Torah to the written Torah. Okay? So therefore, it's not going to tell you things that are written in the written Torah. Okay? That was observation number 2. We're going to make a second observation now. Okay? This second observation I want to talk about is the concise style in the way the Mishnah was written. Okay? Shari, can you please read for us again the middle 2 paragraphs? You see them on the screen in front of you in blue.
I apologize, Zushi, because I don't have the download.
That's okay. But can you see on the screen? Can you see the slide?
With my old eyes, let me see.
Well, I don't know.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for calling on me. Okay.
If you can read these 2 blue paragraphs, and I want to tell everybody what we're looking for. I'd like to try to understand how many laws there are in these 2 paragraphs. Go ahead.
Even the most destitute person in the Jewish nation should not eat unless he is reclining. He should not be provided with less than 4 cups of wine, even if he is being supplied by the public food bank.
Okay, Shari, how many laws do we have in these 2 paragraphs?
Oh my goodness. 1, 2, 3. At least 4.
Yeah, I would say the correct number is 4. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the first paragraph, he didn't tell you that you need to recline on Passover, but it's implied. Why? Because he said even the most destitute person in the Jewish nation should not eat unless he's reclining. Now, this is a rabbinic legislation, but that's a different discussion, right? The main point to understand is, in this law, and this is the origin of it, by the way, we learn that you're supposed to recline during the Passover Seder. Then we learn the second law, which is that even a destitute person, even a poor person who doesn't feel very rich right now, maybe he doesn't feel very free, right? He still needs to recline. Everybody needs to recline. So 2 laws we have. And number 1 is the fact that you need to recline, but he puts them together in one sentence, and that you learn them both out of the same sentence, and he does that again in the second paragraph. This is the origin for drinking 4 cups of wine. He should not be provided with... A destitute person should not be provided with less than 4 cups of wine by the food bank. So law number 1 you have is that a regular person, from here you can clearly imply that a regular person should be eating 4 cups of wine at the Seder, because that's the minimum. And then also that a food bank needs to give it to a poor person if he doesn't have it on his own. In other words, you can't say, oh, for this poor person, 2 cups is enough, 1 cup is enough, because he's destitute and he's taking from a food bank. No, everybody needs to have a minimum of 4 cups of wine at the Seder. And this is the way the entire Mishnah is written. Concise language like this, as short as possible. Why? Because the assumption is these are the cliff notes for the entire oral law that you're supposed to have passed down from generation to generation. Okay, remember, it's the first time they're doing it. They're very, very careful about it. Another point that they make is they're very, very precise in the wording that they use, okay? So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, for example, uses the term Eve of Passover, all right? So, here's the sentence. We must refrain from eating on the Eve of Passover from close to the time for reciting the Mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. In other words, Saturday afternoon this year, you're not allowed to eat before the Seder, because we want to have a hearty appetite at the Seder. Beautiful. So we tell you that from the afternoon on the eve of Passover, right, don't eat anything until the Seder. Now, he didn't need to use these words on the eve of Passover. It could have been understood from the context. And we just learned that he tries to be as concise as possible. So when there's precise wording, you need to be able to infer other things out of it. Let me explain. I'm going to explain by sharing one of my favorite Jewish jokes. Okay, some of you may have heard this from me before. So Josh and Sarah come to visit their Sarah's parents for Hanukkah, and Sarah's mom has a present for Josh, and that present is 2 sweaters, right? 2 sweaters. She's wearing 2 sweaters. Beautiful. Now, the problem is she decided to send them in the mail before they visited her house. So Josh gets this package in the mail, a Hanukkah present on the first night of Hanukkah from Sarah's mom, from his mother-in-law, 2 sweaters. Now, 3 days later, they're going for a Hanukkah party to Sarah's mom's house. And Sarah says to Josh, listen, I know my mom. If you're not wearing one of the sweaters, she is going to be offended. Put on one of the sweaters and comes up, decides which sweater to put on. He puts it on, it comes. The first words out of her mouth, as soon as she looks at it, she goes, what, you didn't like the other one? Right? It's a very good Jewish joke. That's why I like to share it. Right? But here's the key. The key is, this is how every single word of the Mishnah can be treated. From the fact that you said this means that you didn't say this. And the fact that you didn't say this means that you did say this. So let's go back to that statement that we just saw. It says on the eve of Passover, in other words, the afternoon before the Seder, you shouldn't eat in order to make sure you have a hearty appetite for that night's Seder. Now let me ask you a question. Every single week, we have a Friday night dinner. Right? So before a Passover Seder, a Passover dinner, you're not allowed to eat in order that you have a hearty appetite. What about before Shabbat? Are we allowed to eat or not? From this Mishnah, we learn out that you're allowed to. Much more on this next week, by the way. We're going to dive into this. We're going to see how the Talmud does this. But from this Mishnah, from the fact that it says we must refrain from eating, pretend it's in bold or in italics, we must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover, means that on the eve of Friday night, you're allowed to eat. You don't have to come to Friday night with as hearty of an appetite as you do for the Seder. Because the Friday night dinner is we're not as worried about you coming with a hearty appetite as we would be about the mitzvah of matzah. So this is another interesting insight, another interesting observation about the way that the Mishnah is written, is the words are extremely precise. The last thing is, there's no extra words. Okay? Look at that first paragraph again. From when till when are you not allowed to eat? From the time of Mincha, right? What are the next words? It could have said, from around Mincha time and on. It could have just said, from around Mincha time, period. Obviously, you have to eat at the Seder. We all know you need to eat at the Seder. Why does he say until after darkness has fallen? With these extra words, quote unquote, he's trying to teach you something. What is he trying to teach you? Let me tell you in this example. In this example, he's trying to teach you a law about a period of time in Hebrew known as Bein Hashmashot. Bein Hashmashot means between the suns. Okay? So you might not know this, but Judaism, every single day starts from nightfall. Right? The question is, when is nightfall? So we know that from sunset, or from the beginning of sunset, let's call it, that's when the day starts to end. But then there's about a 30-minute period from sunset until dark. Right? 30 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever, however long it is, right? In Judaism, that period is a period when we're not sure if it's still the previous day or if it's already the next day. Why? Because we don't know exactly when the day ends. So that period from sunset until dark is a period when we're not sure. Now, this ends up playing into a lot of laws. On Shabbat, for example, we're stringent. We start Shabbat from sunset. Right? Why? Because to start it from dark, maybe we're doing work on Shabbat that we're not supposed to be doing, so we started from sunset. When it comes to a boy putting on tefillin, we might start from all of these laws. We try to go with whichever one's stringent. Now, when it comes to the Seder night, this Mishnah is teaching us something. What is it teaching us? It's teaching us that in order to start, so we know you're not allowed to eat from Mincha time, right? Till when? Not till sunset, but until nightfall. And only after that can you start your Seder. And this teaches us that the Seder needs to start after nightfall, which is why, by the way, I know it's very inconvenient for a lot of you, but if you every single year Chabad holds its Seder, sometimes it starts at 8 o'clock, 8:30. Last year I invited guests to my home. They ended up not showing up. They showed up early. I told them it was later. They knew the time, but by the time that time came, that's it. They didn't end up showing up. Why? Because the Seder can often be, especially in a place like California, can be very late. It can start at 8 o'clock, 8:30, which is a very late time to start dinner. But from this Mishnah, we learn out that the Seder has to start late. The Seder has to start after dark, right? Not after sunset, but after complete darkness, which is about 30, 40 minutes later. So this is another aspect about the Mishnah. The way the Mishnah was written is that it is written with no extra words. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is that in almost every Mishnah, as I mentioned earlier, there will be multiple opinions. Okay? And this is what I want to talk about. The last paragraph, why don't we ask Dave, if you can read this one for us again. Go for it.
When they pour him his first glass of wine, according to Bet Shammah, he should first recite the blessing over the festival and then the blessing over the wine. According to the Bet Hillel, he should first recite the blessing over the wine and then the blessing over the festival.
So, every Seder, you've been to many Seders, every Seder opens with Kiddush, right? Page 54 in your book, you can see the Haggadah, open to the page for Kiddush. That's the way you start, right? Kiddush contains in it, obviously, the blessing of Hagafen, which is the blessing that we always make over wine. It also has a blessing about the day, a blessing that goes through the theme of the day, right? Which one goes first? Should you first speak about the theme of the day, or should you first speak about the blessing on wine? In which order should you do it? There's two different opinions. Bet Shammai says he should first recite the blessing over the festival, right? Bet Hillel says the opposite way. Now, these multiple opinions are included in the Mishnah. Now, not every Mishnah has multiple opinions. Let's look at what we have here in front of us, right? You have 4 paragraphs. 3 of them don't have any opinions. It's just stated as a fact. What does that mean? It means one of two things. Either, as we mentioned earlier, it's a Stam Mishnah. A Stam Mishnah means an unmarked Mishnah, which means that there was already a consensus beforehand. A consensus was already reached, right? There was no dispute, and therefore he only says with one opinion. Or the other option is what we're learning right now. Could be there were multiple opinions beforehand, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his colleagues, the Kabbalists, are ruling per the opinion that they're stating in the Mishnah, and therefore they stated without an opinion, right? So, some parts of the Mishnah have multiple opinions when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his colleagues could not figure out the consensus between the two opinions, and they state both opinions. But sometimes they state it as a Stam Mishnah, as an unmarked Mishnah. Why? Because either it already was a consensus, or they've decided to rule according to one opinion, and that's why they only state that opinion. You're going to see that when it comes to the Talmud, there's going to be lots of discussion about this. Now, everything that we have just discussed, okay, my friends, everything we have just discussed, all of these different observations about the Mishnah and the style in which the Mishnah was written, can all be seen in their total, to summarize, on page 55. Number 1 is the Mishnah assumes its reader has prior knowledge of basic Torah laws. Number 2, the Mishnah is extremely concise. Number 3, the Mishnah is highly selective in its wording. Number 4, the Mishnah contains no superfluous phrases. And number 5, the Mishnah will include multiple opinions on a single matter of law. Okay? So, what we were just talking about, all these examples of these 5 different observations, that is what the Talmud does. That's what happens in Gemara. The second half of the Talmud, remember I told you the Gemara is the analysis of the Mishnah? Those two things. This week we're learning about the Mishnah. Next week we're going to start learning about the Gemara. Next week's lesson, actually, we're going to watch unfold number 3 and number 5. Number 3, which is that the Mishnah is highly selective in its wording. We are going to see that unfold in next week's lesson. Number 5, which is that the Mishnah includes multiple opinions on a single matter of law and how that works. We're going to see that unfold in the Gemara in next week's lesson. In other words, the Gemara will, because the Gemara knows these axioms about the Mishnah, that the Mishnah assumes that you know everything about that the written Torah said, right? That the Mishnah is extremely concise, that the Mishnah is highly selective in its wording, that the Mishnah contains no because the Gemara knows all that, the Gemara meaning all the sages of the period of the Gemara, therefore when they see something in the Mishnah that seems superfluous, they're going to ask about it and they're going to try and infer something from it. If they see 2 opinions, they're going to try and make sense of the 2 opinions and maybe try and reach a consensus. This is what happens in the Gemara, and I'll leave all that for next week. Okay. To conclude today's lesson, I just want to share a very, very inspiring thought. Really, two inspiring thoughts. Number one is all of this oral law is part of a covenant. Remember the covenant that we said that we are going to remember the Torah and we are going to keep the Torah? It turns out every single one of us is in that covenant with God. From the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the Torah tells us that's clearly in Shemot, in the second book of Exodus, that Hashem says, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ele karati itcha brit vet Yisrael. As per these words, I have formed a covenant between myself and the Jewish people, between God and the Jewish people. God is going to remember the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are going to remember God. In the Talmud, there's actually an interesting statement. And it says, what is this covenant talking about? So you would think, okay, it's talking about the Torah, right? The Talmud says it's actually talking primarily about the written Torah. Ron, can I ask you to read for us, please? Text 8. The crux of the covenant, page 57.
Rabbi Yochanan taught God made a covenant with the Jewish people only for the sake of the Torah materials that were transmitted orally. It is therefore stated, for on the basis of these matters, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel.
This covenant, thank you, Ram, between the Jewish people and Hashem is stated in the Torah as being a covenant on the Torah and mitzvot, al pi, on the basis, right, of these matters, I made a covenant with you and with Israel. But the words al pi in Hebrew also mean by the mouth of. So says Rabbi Yochanan, based on this we can understand that the main covenant between God and the Jewish people is found in the oral law, not in the written law. Why is that? Why do you think specifically in the oral law is where that covenant about the relationship between God and the Jewish people is found, specifically in the oral law? Can I explain it to you? I want you to think about it. If I asked you, where is the home of the written law? Where does the written law reside? What's your answer? Elise, what would you say?
The Torah.
Where is the written law?
Torah.
In the a physical place, in the Torah scroll.
Physical place.
In the Torah scroll.
Torah.
That's where it is. Yeah. Open up an ark, and you will see the words of the written Torah on that scroll. That's how they've survived the generations. That's where they are. That is the home of the written law. That is where the written law is. If I were to ask you, where is the oral law? What is your answer? The answer has to be in the collective minds of the Jewish people. Until the writing of the Mishnah, that was the only place that it was. And even after the writing of the Mishnah, as we saw, because he wrote it so concisely, that just became the springboard for every conversation about oral law. As we'll see next week, that they kept learning it for another 800 years, and it kept evolving with the Gemara. But essentially, the home of the oral law is in the Jewish people, is in my mind and your mind. As we sit here together on a Zoom, and tonight I'll be sitting with another 40 people in person, what's happening? The minds of the Jewish people are keeping the oral Torah alive. Is it any doubt, therefore, excuse me, that the oral law would specifically be where the covenant is alive? The written law, it's almost a covenant between God and the scroll. It doesn't have to involve me. Now, obviously, it does involve us, and it's part of that covenant. But the main place where you see that covenant come to life is in the oral Torah. Phil, if you can read for us, please, from the Maharal of Prague, which is text 9, Oral Unity, on page 58, about just how this plays out.
Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral tradition, exists through human engagement, thereby bonding the Torah with the Jewish people. Had the Torah been confined exclusively to parchment, it would lack this human bond.
And that was the whole purpose of the oral Torah. Remember how last week we spoke? Sorry, not last week. Remember how? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Where did it just go? Remember how at the beginning of today's lesson, we spoke about the effort that's required in oral law. We asked, why? Why would you keep the oral law oral? Why wouldn't you write it all down? If you have more to say, write it down. We said one of the reasons given, besides the other two reasons, one of the reasons given was that when you study oral law, effort is required. In other words, you use your brain. When you use your brain to understand it, to memorize it, to have it be a part of you, you're keeping the Torah alive, not on a scroll, in your heart, in your mind. This is why One of the most interesting observations ever made about the word Mishnah, which I didn't talk about earlier, is made by the Holy Arizal, that the word Mishnah is the same letters as the word Neshama. The Mishnah, of course, is what we've been discussing, the oral law, and the Shama is the Hebrew word for soul. In other words, the Arizal's teaching that Mishnah and the Shama are connected is the reason for the widespread Jewish practice to study Mishnah whenever we can. Because when you study Mishnah, you are elevating your soul. One of the most common times that we study Mishnah, anybody? On a yard site, during Shiva. When we're trying to have a relationship with a soul that has passed on from this world, we study Mishnah. Why specifically Mishnah? Just because the letters are the same? Yes, the letters are the same, but that's hinting to something. What it's hinting to is this idea that the real home of the oral law is inside the Jew, in the Jew's brain, in the Jew's heart, in the Jew's soul. So when you study oral law, it's even more powerful in a way than studying the written law. Why? Because the written law, the home of it is on the scroll, and you're trying to connect to it. But the oral law is in your brain. If you remember last week, we spoke about that connection that happens with God. Remember, God says, Ana nafshi ketavit yahavit. That's the acronym of the word Anochi, the first word of the Ten Commandments. I have put myself into the Torah, God says. So when you study Torah, when you study the wisdom of God, you're not just connecting to God through his wisdom, you're actually connecting directly with God. When you allow the Torah, especially the oral Torah, to seep into your brain, to become part of the exercise you're trying to understand, you connect to God on a level where it's not just you and God and something between connecting you with, but you've removed the medium. It's just you and God. God is the medium. And God himself is in our brain. You become a home for the Mishnah, your soul becomes a home for God and becomes God becomes a part of you. This will conclude today's lesson. I'll ask you to turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 2. The Mishnah. 1. The oral tradition was initially preserved orally to ensure precise transmission, active engagement by students, and exclusivity to the Jewish people. 2. Disputes in halacha began with Hillel and Shammai, due to the Sanhedrin's diminishing ability to resolve questions definitively. 3. Roman persecutions led to the proliferation of halachic disputes and the potential loss of the oral Torah. This necessitated its preservation in written form. 4. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince compiled the Mishnah during a peaceful period, documenting the oral Torah to safeguard it for future generations. 5. The Mishnah was meticulously composed and organized into 6 orders: Zeraim, Moed, Nashim, Nezikin, Kodshim, and Taharot. These cover broad categories of Jewish law. 6. The Mishnah's brevity facilitates efficient memorization and study. Each of its statements conveys multiple laws or principles. 7. Every word in the Mishnah is chosen for precision and clarity, and often implies additional rules or exceptions. 8. Although the Mishnah was composed in part to develop halachic consensus, the authors felt compelled to include multiple opinions on many halachic questions. 9. The study of Mishnah, whose letters are identical to those of the word neshama, soul, strengthens the soul in life and in death because it is fundamental to the covenant between God and the Jewish people.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 2. This has been the Mishnah. And next week we will do lesson 3, decrypting the Mishnah, when we will start our journey into Gemara to appreciate how the subsequent generations after the Mishnah was compiled began to analyze the Mishnah and unpack it for all its meaning. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.